Dáil and Janet, they have absolute privilege. They cannot be sued or held accountable by the courts for anything they say. It has attracted a fair amount of controversy in recent times, and the Ceann Comhairle Sean O'Farrell has launched a forum chaired by Professor David Farrell of UCD. It will examine how freedom of debate inside the House should be balanced against the right of an individual to their good name, and it will look at how abuses of privilege might be dealt with. Also, when the Dáil returns, new rules on speaking times are proposed to rebalance existing allocations seen by Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil as unfair to bigger parties. To discuss these issues, I'm now joined by Peter Burke of Fine Gael.
Well, the question you ask is interesting, and it's even more interesting how it's been responded to by the previous two deputies, because both of them referred to an incident from Mary Lou MacDonald in 2014. This Parliament was elected in 2016. It set up a Dáil Reform Committee, it has a Procedures and Privileges Committee, and it has a newly organised Business Committee. And at no stage, until Paul Murphy raised the question of doubt over the behaviour of the Gardaí in the Jobestown trial, at no stage did any of those committees suggest re-looking at the question of privilege. And I'm on the Privileges and Procedures Committee, and when the Ceann Comhairle contacted me about his move to bring about a sort of an investigative committee that would look at how we go forward, the incidents he cited where Dennis O'Brien, the woman from rehab who was in front of the
Public Accounts Committee.
Apologies, that woman, I always forget her name. And
Angela Cairns.
Yeah, Angela Cairns, thanks very much. And there were one or two others, but both of them had been through the courts. Both of those had gone through the courts, and the courts had found that...
Well, in the Dennis O'Brien instance, there was a case still pending in the courts.
There is. He's appealing it, yes. But
at that time, there was a case pending.
Yeah, and I think that, some people can take the Dáil to court for any reason. But in my short experience there, the only time I really saw it bordering on abuse of privilege was actually, interestingly, when Alan Farrell stood up and accused Deputy Ellis and Deputy Ferris of being involved in the murder of Gardaí. He said they were implicated in it.
And again, both of them were categorical in their denial of that.
But I find it interesting
but can you come back to the point, Brid Smith? What, in your view, would constitute an abuse of privilege? What would someone have to say?
That's what I'm trying to say to you. The only time it came close to my idea of an abuse of privilege was one deputy accusing another deputy of very serious crimes for which they were not tried or found guilty.
But particularly in terms of people who are outside the House. Deputies within the House have the opportunity to come in if they're not present, or come in later and make a statement and clarify an issue or deal with it. But in terms of people who are outside the House, who don't have that right or that entitlement, what would constitute an abuse of privilege in respect of their reputation?
Well, I don't know. You see, I think unless you're telling an absolute barefaced lie that's about to defame somebody, I don't know if you can call it an abuse of privilege. But in the incidents that the Ceann Comhairle mentioned to me, they were not absolute barefaced lies. They weren't proven to be, and even under investigation there's still doubt about one of those cases. So I think we can go, abuse of privilege, but the first time they really threw their toys out of the pram about this issue in the Dáil was after Paul Murphy mentioned
I want to bring in Michael Fitzmaurice, who's in our Athlone studio.
First of all, I think that if you look at how privileges have been used in a good way, if you list things like SiteServe, Project Eagle, the whistleblowers on the Gardaí, calls for public inquiry about Shane O'Farrell or Mary Boyle, that's a positive use of privilege, and we cannot allow that be taken away.
And it is a use where deputies can bring major issues of public concern
to the fore that otherwise wouldn't have been explored or exposed. On the question of sanctions, I think when you look at the makeup of the committee, particularly that Mary Hanifin is the only party member in it, a Fianna Fáil
let's leave, if you like,
the
forum set up by the Ceann Comhairle is a forum set up by him.
I don't know what sort of sanctions they will want to bring in.
But ultimately, sanctions will have to be agreed by the Dáil itself. Would you favour fines, for instance?
I don't really care if they would fine me for something like that, but I just think it is ridiculous. We're entitled to have privilege. We actually don't have as much privilege as other EU countries,
but
and
if
it's ridiculous. But nobody abuses it, Brian. This is a false argument being created in a false atmosphere. There is very little abuse of it. The things I mentioned that are productive out of the issue of privilege, like SiteServe, Garda whistleblowers, etc., are what we should be focusing on.
Let me bring Michael Fitzmaurice in.
I think the effectiveness of the left and other independent groups is what's bothering them, because they did set out agreeing at the Dáil Reform Committee to this structure of a ratio of sharing out the time. And my understanding of the agreement is not as it was reported in the Irish Times, but the actual agreement was that yes, there would be a bit more time given to Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, but they would take it at the end after everybody has had their opportunity to speak. And you know, I notice already when there's any bill is in front of the Dáil, any TD can speak for up to 20 minutes on it. And the people who are complaining that they don't get enough time for their backbenchers don't actually do that. There's very few of the backbenchers use that 20 minutes to either, you know, show themselves or what they believe in, or to represent their constituency. Very, very seldom it happens.
Michael
And yet they're
Fitzmaurice,
looking to take
Michael Fitzmaurice,
time
you're
away.
an independent TD.